Hi, I'm Don Carr, and today I'm going to cover the basics of how to use your amp's effects loop, what it is, how it works, what effects work best in the effects loop, and why you'd want to use it. An effects loop is essentially an insert point between your amp's preamp and power amp section. The preamp is where most of the tone shaping occurs, and the power section's primary job is to make that sound louder. Now, notice I said most of the tone shaping happens in the preamp. The power section always adds color and character to the overall tone, to lesser and greater degrees depending on the amp's design. Now, in any event, the way that the preamp shapes the tone is vastly different, especially if you're using an amp that has higher gain. So an effects loop allows you to place effects pedals or processors after the preamp section between the preamp and power amp. Most effects loops allow you to plug in your effects and play. There's normally an effects send and return jack. Send goes into the input of the effect, and the effects output goes to the return. The reason that this works so well is because most amps have a series buffered effects loop. Basically, it's a circuit in the amp that matches the send level and impedance from the preamp with your effects input. Then on the return side, the output level and impedance are brought back to the correct amount for your power amp section. Most buffered effects loop are unity gain, work with any output level in your effects, so what you put in is what you get out. It's a smart tool for your amp. The benefits to an effects loop are twofold. First, the sound of the effects aren't shaped or distorted by the amp. Now, the sound I can best think of to demonstrate this is reverb. So in this first playing example, I'll play with the reverb in the effects loop on a distorted amp. And then, using the same settings, I'll play with the reverb plugged into the amp's main input. My amp is a Mesa Boogie TC50 and I'm on channel 2, and in the effects loop is a TC Electronic Hall of Fame 2. Using the exact same settings, the only thing I've changed is I've taken the pedal out of the effects loop and I've plugged it into the main input of the amplifier. Okay, the difference is pretty obvious. Reverb in the effects loop sounds more like you'd expect it to. Now, myself being the person that never says never when it comes to guitar sounds, I'll just say that reverb plugged into the front of a distorted amp is a highly specialized option and not necessarily my go-to. Another benefit of using an amp's effects loop is keeping a clean amp clean. Time-based effects tend to add output level and can drive the input section of your clean amp, maybe in ways you don't exactly want. So placing these effects in the effects loop will help you control the amount of breakup in the front of your amp. Now, of course, we all plug all kinds of effects into the input of our amp, and amps without effects loops are at least as common as those with, but the effects loop ultimately gives you more options and control over your sound. So what effects would you want to place in the effects loop of your amp? Well, again, nothing is off limits, but here's a good place to start. Well, typically, time-based effects like reverb and delay work well in the effects loop. Some pedals are used specifically to shape the tone of your amp, like drive, boost, and gain pedals. Now, those tend to work better in the input section of your amp, as do compressors and wah pedals. Beyond this is where the options abound. Modulation pedals work on both sides equally well. Same with harmonizer and octave pedals. Now, some of these may track better seeing the unaffected guitar level input, but not always. Now, a basic principle to keep in mind is that with these effects in the effects loop, the sound of the effect will be more pronounced. Volume pedals can also work in either position. In the effects loop, it's like a foot-controlled master volume, and in the input of your amp, it's a dynamics control, allowing you to hit the front end of the amp differently. I have personally run into a few instances where certain effects loops don't play well with certain volume pedals, so again, experiment and see what works. There's quite a few uses for an amp's effects loop. Remember that it's an insert point between the preamp and the power section. There's some standalone preamps that work well in the effects loop, which is like adding another channel to your amp. And you can also use two amps with the tone from one preamp section by patching from the send of one amp into the return of another. Now, this is a great trick for stereo, especially if you patch something like a stereo delay in the effects loops. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you get started with your Amps effects loop. I can't stress enough that there is no right or wrong here, only different results. Experiment and see what works best for you. And as always, if you have any questions about amps, pedals, or any guitar-related gear, please contact your Sweetwater sales engineer. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click here for more videos like this, or start at sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs.